Okay, starting recording. Is that starting recording? I hope that means okay. Good.
Yes,
All right,
Kyle is recording the call.
All right, we're on. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor Daniel Lasker,
You're welcome.
the author of a new book from the Lippman Library of Jewish Civilization called Karaism, about Karaite Judaism. And we're delighted to be having a conversation with him coming in from Israel. First of all, tell us a little bit about the book and what it's about.
Well, Karaites are a group of Jews who have existed at least for the last 1,200 years, and they have an alternative type of Judaism. In other words, they have a separate calendar, they have a separate dietary laws, they have separate holiday observances, all based on the Tanakh, on the Torah, but on their interpretation of it, which was developed independently of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, and which is embodied in the Talmud. So the book, the purpose of the book is to discuss the history of the Karaites, the practices, their intellectual achievements, and the present situation of the group, which is really very small, but still exists and still has its own institutions and practices.
Very, very interesting. Let me ask you this: what got you interested in? I know you've written a lot on the subject. You've spent perhaps most of your life writing and researching about Karaite Judaism. I've read many of your articles, and it was also very instrumental in my own research and translation that I did on a Karaite book, which I'll talk about more later. My question is, as a modern Orthodox Jew, which I assume you are, what drew you to be so interested in Karaite Judaism, and also why do you think it's important for people to know about it?
Well, first of all, my interest, I would say, is academic. I study medieval Judaism. My major area of interest is medieval Jewish philosophy. And inside medieval Jewish philosophy, I've dealt with the philosophy in the Jewish-Christian debate, and in general, the medieval Jewish-Christian disputations and polemics. I deal a lot with Rabbi Judah Halevi and the Sefer Kuzari. And one of the things that I deal with is medieval Karaite philosophy. At least I started with medieval Karaite philosophy, partially because my late lamented Dr. Vater, my dissertation advisor, Professor Alexander Altman, Zichrono Livracha, introduced Karaite materials into the courses and into the reading requirements. So I started reading it, and I would say it was somewhat of a marginal interest. And then more and more, as I read the text and I read the secondary literature, and I thought that many of the people who had dealt with those texts had it wrong. And then 30 years ago, when the former Soviet Union disappeared, the library in then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, had the collection of the 19th century Karaite Abraham Firkovich, which is one of the greatest discoveries, in a sense, in modern Jewish research. So in the last 30 years, interest and the ability to pursue research has increased tremendously. And as it was developing, I saw that there's no one good introductory volume to Karaites. There are a number of works, there are a number of specific studies, there's a large book which has a collection of articles, but a general introduction which includes what the Karaites actually do, in other words, what makes them different, that wasn't available. And therefore I thought that the time was ripe to write such a book. And the last 2 years, I haven't done a lot of traveling and getting out of my house very much, and therefore it's a good opportunity to write the book.
That's right.
Let me just show the book. This is
sure.
It's an interesting. The cover. Lippman Library always does a very nice job. It's very aesthetic, and you have it also. But the manuscript is a Karaite manuscript of portions of the Book of Exodus, Shemot, which were written in the Hebrew language, but the Arabic script. We're used to Arabic being written in Hebrew, called Judeo-Arabic, and like the Maimonides, the Guide of the Perplexed, and Judah Levi's Kuzari. All these works were written in the Arabic language with the Hebrew script and we call it Judeo-Arabic. It's like sort of Judeo-English, where people throw in Yiddish words and Hebrew words into their English. But the Karaites were the only ones to write Hebrew in Arabic script, and they had a number of manuscripts of the Tanakh, Hebrew language, but Arabic script, which is very important because it also showed how they pronounced Hebrew. And so you're saying, why should someone be interested, or why am I interested? There are lots of things that we as rabbinic Jews, we call rabbinites in this context, can learn from reading Karaite texts and studying them. So it's really enriches the Jewish experience, and the idea that they're just a bunch of heretics and they're no goodniks and never did anything good for the Jewish people, that's really not true.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I wonder what you think about what are the biggest misconceptions that most people, like even, Orthodox people, have about Karaite Judaism. There's so many, I guess, that, what comes to my mind is that Anam ben David was the one who founded it, and he was the one that, because of a slight, because he was not appointed to the post of exilarch. That's, I think, one of the top. And also, they're very, I can't, if I had a nickel every time when I mention Karaites, it's like, oh, are those the guys that do the Passover sacrifice still in Nablus? They're always conflated with Samaritans, which is another very interesting topic because there were some ties between the two. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions which this book is trying to address?
Okay, so first of all, the Anan story obviously is the biggest one because most people, if you ask them about Karaites, all they know, if they know anything, is the Anan story. And we know that that even if the story were true, which it probably isn't, Anan had nothing to do with Karaites. Anan had a group called Ananites, Anania. 100 years later, after Anan, 150 years, the Karaites, rewriting their history, adopted him, perhaps because he was of the family of the Rosh Galuta, the exilar. But it's not only the fact that Anan was the misattributed as the founder of Charism, but the idea that Charism and Ananism, or Charism and Anan, are the same thing. So I'll give you an example. There's a Karaite, Yaakov Kirkasani, in Iraq, in Baghdad, about 150 years after Anan. And he writes in his book, a very long, important legal and polemical work. He writes about how Anan didn't believe in medicine. Why did Anan not believe in medicine? Because the verse in Exodus says, Ki ani Hashem rofecha, I am the Lord, your doctor, your healer. And therefore, he said, according to Anan, you shouldn't use medicine. Now, if you look at books written in so-called Jewish medical ethics from Rabbi Jacobovitz and Bleich and Rosner, all these very interesting books about the halacha of Jewish medicine, they often start out with an introduction comparing Rabbinic Judaism, which glorifies medicine in a sense, and Charism, which is it's obscurantus and stupid, and they don't believe in doctors. But it's when the person who told us about Anan's view, we don't have it from Anan's works himself gives justifications for the use of medicine, which are very similar to the Rambam's justifications. He says, God provides us with food. That doesn't mean you don't have to till the land and produce the food. God can give us health, but we have to help God along. And then if you look at the history of Karaites, there's Aaron ben Joseph HaRofeh. They were in early modern Lithuania. Many of the Karaites were court doctors. So this is, again, an idea. Well, if Anan said it, it must be true for everything else in Charism, which unfortunately is not true. I think another thing is that because the Karaites in the 20th century separated themselves from the Jewish people so that they wouldn't be considered racially Jewish, that the Karaites, the Rabbinites, the rest of the Jews didn't really get along. But we have so many examples of part of all of one political group in a sense. In other words, under the Islam, the Muslims said they're all Jews. They looked at them as Jews. They're just different types of Jews, just as there are different types of Muslims. We have a story in the 11th century from Ramla, that the head of the synagogue there was writing to the authorities, the Jewish authorities in Egypt, and saying he has a problem because they have people in his synagogue who say, you do it our way, or we're going to go to the Karaite synagogue next week. So it wasn't like it was totally separate groups. Even if the leadership said, they should be banned and they're no good and they're heretics, etc., Karaite Jews and Rabbinite Jews live together, usually in harmony. There are places, Benjamin Tudela, 12th century, said that in Constantinople there was a wall between the communities, but generally, until the 20th century, the Karaites saw themselves as part of the Jewish people. Other Jews saw them as part of the Jewish people, and the issue was marriageability and whether or not they're heretics, but not whether or not they're Jews.
Right. It's interesting because even in places like Byzantium, Constantinople, and later on the Ottoman Empire, you had a lot of intermingling. And as you write in the book, the whole Bashiatsi school of Karaite reform, I guess you can call it, was a result of close ties with rabbinism. He himself was a disciple of Mordechai Comtino, who was a famous rabbinic scholar. And there was a disagreement among the rabbinites whether they should take Karaites as students. But the fact that there is such a disagreement and the fact that many of them did have Karaites as students shows the close degree of interaction between them. And then we also see intermarriage. I mean, there's no greater indication of your approval for the other side than actually letting your children marry their children. And that was very, very common, as we see from the Tubot that we find in Cairo Geniza, and down to this day. I know that there marriages between Karaites and Rabbinites are extremely commonplace. And there's usually, I don't know if you were the one to mention it, there's usually a Sephardic rabbi that gives a stamp of approval. Officially, perhaps the Karaite must kind of let go of their Karaite beliefs, but that doesn't really happen. How does that really work when both sides are secular in a secular state of Israel? But I'm kind of skipping ahead.
Yeah, well, the secular Jews in Israel are still rabbinites. They still follow rabbinic Judaism. They still light Hanukkah candles, maybe with a bracha, maybe without. They still have a Seder on Passover night. They have an Afikoman, and they have the 4 questions. All these things they don't have the Karaites have a Seder, but on a different night. Yeah. But it's interesting when you say it's Sephardi rabbi, it's because the poskim, the decisors in Egypt were much more lenient on the question of this intermarriage. And we have, as you said, ketubot, the marriage contracts from the Geniza, which are basically prenuptial agreements, whose dietary laws, whose family purity laws, whose holidays would they follow, or how they would follow them. Whereas the Ashkenazim, going back to Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles in the Shulchan Aruch, who said that the tears cannot be put back together, a kara'ayim with an ayin, and this goes back to supposedly when the Balei Tosfot, Shimshon of Shans. So Ashkenazim have generally, even though there has been intermarriage, have generally objected to intermarriage, whereas in the medieval period there obviously was, because we have ketubot, and in the 16th century the Radbaz came up with a halachic justification of it, where he said that the real problem of intermarriage is perhaps the question of mamzerim. If a Karaite couple gets married, they're supposedly married, and one of the ways that it's very similar to the rabbinic way. If they get a divorce, though, and it's not a kosher get, the woman is still a married woman. And if she marries another Karaite or any other man and has a child with that man, that child is a mamzer, which is unmarriageable. So that's the real problem, the question of doubtful mamzerut, whether or not they're marriageable. What the Radbaz said is the original marriage is not a valid marriage because the communities are so far away. It's inconceivable that at the original Karaite marriage there were kosher witnesses. So it's not a marriage. They don't need a divorce. So the second marriage is also not a marriage, but is also no problem with mamzerut. And it's very interesting that Rav Moshe Feinstein adopted this view concerning reform marriage in America. It's a very controversial statement that he made, but he came up to basically the same conclusion, that a couple who decides to have a reform marriage in America are sort of denying having real kiddushin, and therefore it's not really a marriage, and it's gave the same solution to mamzerut. Again, very controversial for Rav Moshe Feinstein. But in general, the rabbis of Egypt, whether Radbaz or his student Marie Castro, or Rabbi Avadia Yosef, who was the head of the Beit Din in Cairo and from 1945 to 47, all had the same decision, namely that since the marriages are not marriages, the divorces don't have to be divorces, and therefore there's not a question of mamzerut. But the rabbis have a lot of leeway in Israel on many issues, and one of them is marriage, and really depends on the attitude of the rabbis and the rabbinut.
I'm actually curious. Did Rav Moshe ever address the Karaites in terms of that on a par with Reform Jews? Because that would be very kind of interesting. That Rav Moshe would.
I don't know. It's the same ma'alach, we say in Hebrew, the same way of
same degree, same idea, sort of.
Right, but I don't think he mentions Karaites there. He does mention the problems of the Ethiopians, and he does not accept them as being Jewish, which means that they don't have a problem with mamzerut if they convert. And often the Rabbanut asks even those who the traditions of being Jewish, once they convert, it's a lot easier to be a convert than it is to be a mamzer, because a convert can marry than a Kohen.
Yep.
But mamzer can only marry a freed slave or another mamzer, when we don't have very many freed slaves around nowadays.
Right. Another misconception that I think is not tackled enough is this notion that Karaites are literalists and they take everything that the Bible says exactly as it is written and with no kind of easy way out. And one of the things, and you mentioned this, is the concept of levirate marriage, where yibum, where we take it as when a brother dies childless, that brother has to marry his childless brother's widow and make children and build his brother's house. That's the way we explain it. And the Karaite view is actually non-literal in this case. At least that's the way I guess we would view it, albeit we're not objective. That achim, yeshivu achim yachdav, doesn't refer to actual brothers, but brothers in the colloquial sense, that it's your townsman or your neighbor. That is perhaps the accepted Karaite view, although I do recall distinctly Bashiatzi bringing down in his compendium in Aderet Eliyahu, I believe it was either Yeshua ben Yehuda or one of the other Karaite, one of the big Karaite decisors, I guess, who does accept the rabbinite view. So my point is that as much as we like to think, as much as perhaps they would like to think that they're literalists and that they have less discord, because one of the things I like to point out is to say, oh, look at the rabbinites. How can they say they have an oral law that is accurate when they have so many disagreements? And the truth is that they have just as many, if not more. And this
yes,
that's one
of the arguments Rabbi Yehuda Levi makes him against him, the Kuzari. But let me just mention about Yibum. The problem is as follows. The book of Vayikra says that a man is absolutely forbidden to have sexual relations with his sister-in-law, his brother's sister. Right. And this sister-in-law, who has no children, with whom he's obligated to marry, if she had a child or a child on the way or whatever, in other words, his brother's child, it would be absolutely forbidden. And there are examples of people I've heard of who've married their brother's widow who had children, and that's absolutely gilui arayot, it's incest. So the Karaite said it's not possible that a real brother who had children, it's absolutely forbidden to marry, and a real brother without children, one is absolutely obligated to marry. And therefore, achim must mean something else. And Matovu Manaim, Shevet Achim Gam Yacha doesn't mean actual brothers. Ach can also use a lot of other things. But what they say is not that they're literalists, but that they interpret the Torah without regard to a tradition which they think is not a true tradition, the rabbinic tradition. That, as you point out, the reason the rabbinic tradition can't be true is because of the contradictions, because of the fact that the rabbis disagree with each other, because of the fact that God is never presented as having revealed the Mishnah. It never says God said to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi thus and thus. And because there are things which seem to be in violation of the Torah. I'm just reading now. I'm working on editing a 12th century Karaite, very important Karaite work, Eshkol Kofer of DeJudaization. And what I was working on today was it's divided into the 10 Commandments, the 8th commandment, Lo Tignov. And he points out that the rabbis say, you have two places in the Gemara, that the verse referring to a person who's breaking into your house underground, if there's a thief who's breaking into the house secretly, according to the Torah, if you kill him, there's no fault involved because you don't know why he's breaking into your house. But it says two places in the Talmud that if he succeeds in stealing from you, the property belongs to him because he's made such a great effort to break into your house. It's in Baba Kama in Sanhedrin. And the DeJudaization says, this is crazy. What are you talking about? It says, don't steal. I mean, stealing in the Machteret is the same as stealing, breaking to the house regularly or grabbing someone's purse. So it's those types of things where they say the rabbinic interpretation goes against the Torah. They say their own interpretation might not be literal, but it doesn't contradict the Torah. And if the Torah says count the Omer from the day after the Sabbath, it means count the Omer on the day after the Sabbath, on a Sunday. But on certain other things, when it says bind it on your arms or put it on your doorposts, they don't take that literally. They don't, as we do in Tefillin and Mezuzah. They say it's a reminder. You should remember that there are lots of words like in Mishlei where you have binding something, just means remembering it. So it's a different alternative way of understanding halacha. In fact, they don't even use the word halacha, at least in classical texts. It's a way of understanding the mitzvot. And they accept individual effort, but altogether is a generally accepted way of doing it in the Karaite practice.
Right. It's interesting. I want to go back to the Yibum idea. We do see in the Torah this concept, most famously with Judah, the sons of Judah, Er and Onan, marrying his childless widow and getting punished for not actually fulfilling the mitzvah, I guess, of Yibum. Do they have the same concept of before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah?
Yes, to a certain extent, yes. Because the other example of Yibum is Ruth,
right,
where he's not a brother. He's even though Naomi says to Ruth, I'm not going to have another child to marry you. Let me just go back to what you mentioned about Bashachi and Yeshua ben Yehuda. What happened is that Anan's view of incest, of Gilui Arayot, is basically that all of the husband's relatives become all the wives' relatives. Right. Therefore, you can't have two brothers marrying two sisters. You can't have even let's say a stepfather, a father. Let's say a couple's one's mother and one's father dies. They're the surviving people, if they're the parents of the couple, of a husband and wife, can't get married. Right. By expanding the law such a great extent, it became almost impossible in a small group to find marriageable partners. So what Yeshua ben Yehuda did was restrict the large growth of restricted or illegal incestuous partners. And therefore, by limiting those who are no longer considered to be first degree or second degree incest, they could have closer relatives do the yibum, closer relatives than what could be done before. But not the brothers. Brothers themselves, they do not have actual brothers do yibum because of the prohibition in Vayikra.
Right. You mentioned Ethiopian Jews briefly, and I'd like to ask something about that. It was a Karaite friend of mine, I guess you can call him one of the former Karaites, Karaite Karaite. He was mentioning to me how Ethiopian Jew once passed a Karaite synagogue, and he was wondering about who these people are. He knew it wasn't a regular synagogue. He saw that they were doing the prostrations and kind of, not using the light. And he said, this reminds me of how kind of we used to worship back in Ethiopia. And he started attending. And then somehow the rabbinate got wind, and they threatened to kind of revoke their Jewish status if they kept on kind of fraternizing with Karaites. This was in Beersheba or Ofakim, I don't remember. It's interesting because the recently I read that the rabbinate did kind of call them a sort of Karaites. The actual belief, the original Beta Israel Ethiopian Judaism, is a very sort of scripturalist and very similar in many ways to Karaism. How similar and how dissimilar are they, and are there any ties between the two?
Okay, so I don't know enough about authentic Ethiopian Beta Israel practices. In fact, it's getting harder and harder to determine what exactly they did in Ethiopia 200 years ago before the European Jews came and changed things around.
Right.
There are certain things which are common, but for instance, things that aren't, like menstrual laws, where in Ethiopia they had a separate hut for women. The calendar is different. They, like the Karaites, eat very little on Pesach because of making sure nothing gets leavened at all. The Karaites are much stricter leaven than Rabbinites. But there really is no relationship. When the Ethiopians started coming, I was once with the Karaite rabbis. Now they call themselves rabbis. It's very ironic. But the Karaite Religious Council, and they were discussing to the extent to which they should try to adopt them or welcome them. And one was saying, well, the Ethiopians just prove that the Torah Shebaal Peh is an invention because they separated from the Jewish people before Torah Shebaal Peh was invented. So if they left after giving the Torah on Matan Torah and Sinai, it didn't have the oral Torah, that proves there was no oral Torah. And one of the other ones said, you know what, everybody knows there's no oral Torah. Everybody knows that this is an invention. So we don't need the Ethiopians. And I think both sides understand. In fact, I once wrote a little article in the Jerusalem Post about this, that it was not to the benefit of either group to try to integrate with each other, because the Ethiopians' big problem was being accepted into Israeli Jewish society. And for them to suddenly say, oh, by the way, we're going to be Karaites also, that's would not be very smart on their part. And the Karaites are not, it's, as I point out in the book, for many centuries did not accept converts and really were very insular, and very few people actually joined Karaism. The last couple of decades, they've tried to start having converts. They convert people to Judaism, but they convert them as Karaites. The Ethiopians wouldn't be included in that.
Right. That's something that vexes me. I'm just wondering, I don't know, this is obviously something, their decision that they made, why they would want to do something like that and further complicate their status, and which is still in limbo, as you mentioned, in present day Israel.
Yeah, so there's no, as far as I know, any real relation. The story that you told, it was possible that there's one person, but I haven't seen any discussion of the Rob.
I mean, Karaites. Why would Karaites begin sort of encouraging conversion among America places and South America places like that?
Okay, it's called demography, and some people think demography it determines the future.
Yep.
Yeah. If the Karaites, and people ask me how many Karaites there are in the world, and about 20, 30 years ago, I used to say, well, one encyclopedia says 20,000, or Israeli Karaites, one encyclopedia says 25,000. It wouldn't bother me so much, but I wrote both articles. So no one knows. They try to inflate the number of Karaites for their own purposes. One has to ask who is a Karaite, and this is not so easy to determine. There are a lot of Israeli Karaites who basically hide the fact. They don't want anything to do with the community. They're secular Jews. They're secular Israelis. Why should they have any problems? So if they go to get married, they don't tell anybody. They don't identify with the community. So does one count them? Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm right there. I just had to take up the notifications. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. If you say all together in the whole world, maybe there are 50,000 Karaites out of the 14 million Jews. That's not very much. So they're worried about continuity, and that's on one hand. On the other hand, there are a number of people, especially in America, former fundamentalist Christians, who believe the Bible is the Word of God, but come to the conclusion the New Testament isn't the Word of God, and come to the conclusion that Jesus was not the Messiah. So they say, well, the Bible is the Word of God. We have to be Jews. So they go looking, investigating what Judaism is. Some of them are places where there are no Jewish communities. Others are in places where there are some Jewish communities, but they don't know very much. And those who find real Jewish community, rabbinic Jewish communities, are said, oh, yeah, great, you know the Bible. Now let's learn the Talmud. And they say, well, what's this Talmud business? And then they discover there's a group of Jews, they can become Jewish, who are not following the Talmud, who follow the Word of God in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So, as I point out in the book, a number of these converts are people who had been raised as fundamentalist Christians, lost their belief in Jesus, kept their belief in the holiness and the revelation of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, and Karaism was a good match for them. And a number of them have become Karaite leaders, just as there have been a number of former rabbinites who became convinced that Karaite Judaism is the correct Judaism. They also have become very active in the movement. But again, the numbers are very small, and this is really, the demography is destiny, and they're playing the demographic game as much as they can.
Which reminds me of the Samaritans, who have a similar sort of dilemma. And they've also started bringing in non-Jewish, again, non-Samaritan women to convert from the former Soviet Union. And this is a similar situation, which also reminds me that of the interesting relationship between Karaites and Samaritans, who are often confused for each other, at least when you ask people today. There were some contacts. Of course, there are some fundamental differences, chiefly the fact that the Samaritans don't accept Jerusalem as the place that God chose, and they don't accept the prophets and hagiographa. They only take the 5 books. But there were relations. I know that Yusuf al-Basir wrote a polemic against Gerizim being the chosen place, and I know that Furkovich, but he's a man interesting in of itself, claimed that there was a strong bond between the two. He actually went to visit them, but that's only because he wanted to buy a bunch of manuscripts.
Buy is saying it nicely.
Right. What are there any contacts between the two? Because you do mention that according to the Israeli, there was a special Israeli ministry of Karaites and Samaritans. I don't know if does that still exist?
Well, I'd say it's the Karaite Samaritan desk in the Department of Religious Affairs. The problem, there's a fellow who wrote to me, a retired Israeli, who wrote to me out of the blue with a book, very upset that I call Karaism the longest surviving alternative Judaism when Samaritanism.
Samaritan, yeah, a lot of people.
So I said, well, I mentioned on page such and such. So he goes and reads page such and such, and he says, but you say they're not Jewish, but they are Jewish. The only people who think they're not Jewish are the Orthodox rabbinate, who doesn't accept any non-Orthodox as being Jewish. So I said, look, I think we disagree as to who is a Jew and what is Judaism, so we'll leave it at there. But I think the big difference is that Samaritans might claim to be the ancient Hebrews, but they never were Jewish. And at the times when there were the closest relations between Samaritans and Jews, they were accepted sort of quasi-Jews, but never considered halachically Jewish. And they never associated themselves with Judaism or the Jewish people as our religion developed. And if you want to know how Jews, Judeans, Israelites reacted to Samaritans, read the New Testament, where the Samaritans are always the odd people out because they're not really part of the group.
Right.
And the Karaites are much, much different because they were always part of the Jewish group. They're always considered Jews. Now, Samaritans had certain issues in terms of interpretation of the Bible when they wrote the old Hebrew alphabet, and they wrote in Arabic under the Islamic countries, which is basically where they were. And therefore, there were contacts between them. The issue of whether Jerusalem or Shechem is the Qibla, the direction of prayer, was a very interesting subject altogether because it's part of the larger debate among Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Samaritans as to where God's presence is, in which direction does one pray. So they obviously knew of each other group, but it's just, from my point of view, is it just, even though people confuse them, there's no comparison. There's one group is constantly part of the Jewish tradition for at least 1,200 years. The other group has constantly been in competition with Jews for 2,500 years.
Right. So there are some major unbridgeable differences, obviously.
Yeah, right.
Let me talk a minute about what my Karaite Israeli friend called the Ashkenazi Karaites, and he himself is an Egyptian Karaite, and
Okay.
we used to hang out in the old city. Sometimes I would go to the ancient Karaite synagogue, which is apparently one of the oldest, perhaps continuously used synagogue in Israel, in the old city of Jerusalem, which they converted into a museum recently. I haven't had a chance to see that.
No,
He
they
said,
added
right,
a heritage
right,
center. The synagogue is still there, still used for
right,
prayers.
right. And he mentioned, and there was a book by Yusuf El-Gamil, who you mentioned, who just churns out lots of literature. And there's one about, this is a very fascinating character, which you mentioned just in passing, the actual last Karaite rabbi of the in the Middle East. It was Tovia Babovich, or
Yeah.
Tovia Babovich. He
It
died
was
in
the last
1996.
Karaite chief rabbi in Cairo,
In the Middle
and he
East, that was
himself
that.
came from Crimea.
Right. He originally was born in Crimea. Obviously, his surname shows his, Slavic surname. Um, he was a fascinating figure, sort of like a self-taught, autodidact, polymath. Wrote prodigiously. Al-Gamil published a 2-volume biography called Pirkei Tovia. It's just a hodgepodge of all kinds of interesting things that he said, and the stories and this and that. And he sort of kind of tried to do a renaissance and get the community, educate the kids, and sort of trying to create. Of course, he failed, and it was a losing game. But it's very fascinating to see, the things that he wrote and what he tried to do and his philosophy, and just a fascinating figure that I found of interest. Sean actually, the Karaite Press, who you mentioned, of course, is trying to republish a lot of Karaite classics. One of the books that Babovich wrote that he wanted me to translate was called Rosh Pinah. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, which was a biography of the three, who he terms the three founders of the Karaite faith: Anan, Benjamin Awendi, and Daniel Al-Kumisi. So I had a lot of fun doing that. Where was I going with all this? So I wanted to mention about Babovich. What are your thoughts on Babovich and what he was trying to do, and kind of like his literature? Was it just basically mostly rehashing old stuff? Do you have any original ideas, you think?
I don't know his work well enough. I know Al-Gamil's collection, as you said, is a hodgepodge. Um, Unfortunately, for all the publications that Al-Gamil does, one has to use them very carefully. He's not a careful copier of the texts.
Yep.
But in terms of Babovich, but basically the Egyptian Karaite community had a very difficult problem of creating their own leadership. But to a certain extent, the Egyptian rabbinite community also did. I mentioned that Rav Avadia Yosef was the head of the Beit Din from 1945 to 1947. Well, there's no local rabbinite Egyptian leadership that could be that. And if you go back to the Rambam, was also an import. So Egypt has a long tradition of importing Jewish religious leaders, whether Karaite or Rabbinite. Babovich came to Egypt at a time as the Zionist movement was developing, and he had to negotiate very delicately between the Egyptian nationalism, the Karaite desire to be accepted by the Egyptians, and they were very assimilated in the mid 20th century in Egypt, and the separate Jewish identity and a separate Karaite Jewish identity. And he was one of the ones who recommended, he tried to prevent the community from leaving to going to Israel, thinking that they would lose their identity. But I think he died in 57, right after the Suez campaign, at which point Jewish life in Egypt became untenable, both for Karaites and Rabbinites. Also after the Lavon affair and the public hanging of the Egyptian Karaite Moshe Marzuk as an Israeli spy.
Um, what do you? So there's a strong sort of dividing line between the Crimean and Eastern European Karaites, who most of them today don't consider themselves Jews, and the Middle Eastern Karaites, who obviously very Jewish, very Zionist, most of them, I would say. My question is, there was a gradual de-Judaizing or de-Judification that went on, that started. Ooh. I don't know what that was. Well, I do know what that was. I'm sorry. You still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, there was some kind of weather alert that sort of interrupted me. Yeah, you lost your video. Sorry.
Yeah, I still see myself on video.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we're back.
You see me?
Yeah, I see you.
Okay. So let me talk about this DeJudaization.
Yeah.
A number of years ago, a very important scholar, William Brenner, wrote an article called "The Karaites of Islam, the Karaites of Christendom," and he claimed that under Islam, Karaites claimed to be Jewish because it was good for them, because if you weren't Jewish, Christian, or Zoroastrian, you didn't have any status under Islam. But the Jews under Christianity claimed they weren't Jewish because to be Jew under Christianity was bad. Now, it's an interesting insight. The only problem was that it wasn't totally accurate. So that the Byzantine Karaites under the under Christian Eastern Christianity were always part of the Jewish community, and Karaites in Crimea, which under the Ottoman Empire were the ones who started breaking away or not being as close to Judaism. But the real break started at the end of the 18th century when Russia, Germany, and Austria divided up Poland and Eastern Europe. I mean, the war that's going on today in Ukraine, it goes back to the competition between the great powers over this area, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics. And suddenly, all these countries, which had very few number of Jews, had tons of Jews until the division of Poland. Jews were not basically Jews were not allowed in Russia, and suddenly Russia inherited all kinds of Jews. So the question was, what do we do with these Jews? And the Austrians were the first ones to say, okay, we're going to tax them. We're going to give them special taxes. And there are very few number of Karaites in Volhynia or Galicia who became part of Austria, and they went to Maria Theresa, the empress, and said, look, we're not the same type of Jews, so maybe you could give us a break on the taxes. And she said, okay. And then the Russians had their own issues with the taxes, and then the draft of Jewish children, the 25-year draft that would last 25 years. You may be familiar with one Russian suggestion what to do with the Jewish problem: 1/3 emigrate, 1/3 convert, and 1/3 die. So the Karaites again said, well, we don't want to have to pay these extra taxes. Well, let's convince the czars that that's not us. The bad Jews are somebody else. The bad Jews are people with the Talmud. And for centuries, the Christians had this terrible view of what the Talmud was. They thought this was this blasphemous, disgusting book. So when the Karaites went to them and said, look, we don't believe in this Talmud. We're different Jews. We're good Jews. We're productive Jews. We till the land. We're not money lenders, etc. They somehow convinced the czars to accept them as a separate group. And in 1861, they actually had the same freedoms of any other non-Russian Orthodox Christian citizen. But Firkovich, who we mentioned, took it a step further to reinvent Karaite history, that suddenly they were from the 10 lost tribes. They were the ones who were exiled to Samaria. They were the Khazars. They were connected to the Khazars. So this idea that the Karaites were different types of Jews, not only in their practice, but also in their background, that sort of took hold. And then the 20th century, the Straya Shopsil said, oh, we're not Jews at all. We're not racially Jews. We're Central Asian tribe. We speak a Central Asian Turkic language, which is true. And you have to remember the early 20th century, anti-Semitism, which for years, for centuries, had been religious anti-Semitism, suddenly became racial anti-Semitism. The Jews were hated not because of what they believed or practiced, they were hated for what they were as a race. So he convinced all the Karaites to say we're no longer a race. And this was the 1910s, 1920s. 1930s come the Nazis, and they say, well, we're not Jews, don't kill us. And the Nazis asked the rabbinic leaders in Poland and said, what about these Karaites? Are they Jews? And the rabbis understood that they said they're Jews, they would be signing their death warrant. So they said, no, they're not Jews. And that was the final break. So today you'll find the Karaites, most of the Karaites in Eastern Europe, whether in Troki in Lithuania or in Crimea, saying that they're a different ethnic group, Central Asian tribe, Old Testament religion, but not Jews. Apparently, in the recent decades, there's some of these Karaites, in Crimea at least, who have suddenly discovered when they go to the Karaite cemetery, they see Hebrew written there, and they look at their books and they see, they're in Hebrew, and they say, well, maybe there is something to this Jewish business. I don't know the extent to which they want to identify as Jews because it's useful, and actually there are some Karaites who made Aliyah, who immigrated to Israel from Eastern Europe under the law of return. But in general, the party line still is we're not Jews, we're a different group. We adopted an Old Testament religion. And they also must have forgotten any Hebrew.
Right. How does the Egyptian Karaite community address all this? Because I know there's at least some people in the community that originate from Crimea or Eastern Europe. The one in particular comes to mind. He's pretty active. I can't recall his name offhand.
Kafeli, Avram Kafeli.
Right. Definitely, yeah. What is the overall attitude? Do they accept them if they want to join?
Okay, so first of all, they definitely accept them. Second of all, there is this Kafeli, who was one of the few Crimean Karaites who at least had family traditions of being Jewish or of being of traditional Karaism with Hebrew and tunes and liturgy. He does what in America would be called Keruv work. He goes and tries to get the Eastern European Karaites to be part of the general Karaite community. It's a big problem because many of these people have no Jewish identity. They've brought up to say we're not Jewish and not be very sympathetic to them. Almost all of them are intermarried, many of whom people who are believing Christians, not just their secular non-Christians or Christians, but actively Orthodox Christians. So that's the work they're doing on this Keruv of bringing them close. And the Karaites, again, demography is destiny. And if they can get more and more people to be part of the group, they see themselves have a great future. And that's the reason for the conversion. That's the reason for the outreach. And if they could get more Karaites from Eastern Europe, they'd be more than happy to have them.
I mean, everything you said describing the Crimeans and Eastern European Karaites applies to all Jews from the former Soviet Union. I mean, most Jews in the world. This was the experience, right?
Well, no, except that in the former Soviet Union, a rabbinic Jew had on his passport Jew, whereas right. A Karaite had on his passport Karaite. And the Karaites spent all their time saying we're not Jewish, whereas the Jews spent their time trying not to get beat up for being Jewish. So the Jews, even though there are all the questions of conversion and intermarriage and belief in Christianity among the two groups, at least the ones that came who identify as rabbinic Jews or somehow connected to rabbinic Jews do understand the relationship to Jewish people. Whereas the Karaites, the relationship is much more tenuous.
Right. This brings me to the touchy subject, which is the Karaite experience during the Holocaust, both as bystander, survivor, and perhaps perpetrator. There's been quite a bit of research on this. What I found interesting in my own preliminary research was the sort of degree of the contrast, not just the contrast, like how some did absolutely sort of collaborate and some went out of their way to help Jews. I know that in Galicia, for instance, perhaps in Galicia, the Karaites there, from my reading, were sort of the firmest, the most rabbinized of all the Karaites. Even the Torah that they used was like an Ashkenazi Torah with like Sukkim of Chazal. And this is in Galich, for instance. And I know that in Kolomaya, for instance, some Karaites went really risked their lives to save Jews. But in Vilna, the experience seems to have been sort of either active collaboration or sort of kind of closing themselves off. What is your thought on that? Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, the Nazis unfortunately were very, very well organized, and they expected to get lists of communities, and there were rabbinic Jews in Vilna or in other places in Lithuania who tried to get their names onto the Karaite community list, and the Karaites generally objected to that. Vilna was a city in which Shai Shapsil lived. He lived peacefully throughout World War II. He died in the 1850s. He claimed, supposedly, when the Russians took over, that he always had the pictures of Lenin and Stalin in his attic. So he tried to make he tried to get along with everyone to survive.
I was in charge.
Yeah. Right. And one of his survival tactics was not doing anything to help the Jewish community, which he felt would jeopardize his own community. Right, wrong. That's the way he acted. There were Karaites who were killed under the policy, were murdered by the Nazis under the policy of kill first, ask questions later. But as I said, they were very organized, so they tried to get these. They had their scientists, their anthropologists, they asked the rabbis, and they generally didn't touch the local communities. Now, if you have a local community of able-bodied men of army age, and you need cannon fodder, then you make it very convenient, just like the local Poles and local Ukrainians and the local Baltics and Lithuanians. Many of them joined the Nazi forces because they figured to their advantage. They make the rulers happy, get a steady income and food. And so there's some Karaites who apparently did that also. There's a fellow from Crimea, not Karaite, not Rabbi, not Jewish, Mikhail Kizilov, who has been studying he's been doing much archival work on the Holocaust. And when his research comes out, I think it'll be the definitive work on the Karaites and the Holocaust. And meanwhile, there are all the anecdotal stories, and some are more sympathetic to Karaites, some are less sympathetic to Karaites.
Yeah, I definitely read a lot of his work. His Karaites of Eastern Europe is extremely fascinating work, where he discusses how Shapshal even had rabbinite disciples that he taught, I think, certain subjects that had a very good kind of positive reminiscences of him. Nothing is as black and white as it's been given over. Yeah, it's absolutely a fascinating subject, which I'm looking forward to reading more about. One last question. It seems this is a very confusing thing, because on the one hand, Karaites in general did not encourage conversion. On the other hand, they did, at least in the Middle Ages and beyond, try to recruit rabbinites. To what degree of success, we don't know. There's very little evidence of that. But there certainly were some who joined. I like to think that the Rabbi Hanukkah, who's mentioned in the Misha Berach, that they give every Shabbat, Rabbi Elisha, Rabbi Hanukkah, and Rabbi that Hanukkah has to have been a rabbinite. There's no way a Karaite would give a name Hanukkah, right? That was always something I wondered about.
I really don't know about this.
Yeah.
But the great age of Karaite missionaries is really the 10th century. And there was a growth of Karaism. We just don't know if anybody actually converted or it changed from, other than those people who changed shuls because they didn't like the policy of the synagogue president. We don't have, I often use the example that I would love to have a conversion account. What I mean by that is we have a lot of Jews who became Christians who wrote afterwards why they became Christians.
Right.
Their discouragement, the exile.
One from Egypt were Spanish, were they conversos who joined the community?
Yeah, there's some story. It's unclear exactly what happened, but we don't have. I want someone to write I had a great desire for a cheeseburger, so I became a Karaite so I could have milk and meat together. But we don't have such testimonies. And all the people that we know, all the early Karaites, not one of them we know is a former Rabbinite, unless you call Anan, who was part of the Gonic hierarchy. But even he wasn't a Karaite. He just formed his own group.
You're saying there's no evidence, although we have suspicions of some. I mean, you mentioned the one in Egypt, the one in Spain, Al-Tarabi. What was his name?
Ibn al-Taras.
Right.
But he was a Karaite in Spain who went to Israel to study in the academies in the land of Israel in the 11th century, and then he came back to spread Karaism there. There's no indication that he had once was born a Rabbinite Jew and converted. We have a 12th century Egyptian from Damascus poet named Moshe Dari, who originally, being Dari, was from West Africa, and there's some indication that maybe he grew up as a Rabbinite. But again,
we don't have any evidence of that. The reason I brought that up is because because it doesn't seem like they were very successful, and at some point, sort of the dividing line, there was sort of those dividing lines where the gates closed, and on both sides you have, at least in the Ashkenazi world, where the Rama writes Karaim einam mitachin, double entendre there, where Karaites are no longer eligible to join, to kind of rejoin us, so to speak. Yeah. On the other hand, you don't see the Karaites don't really seem to have accepted. I don't know if there were any people who went over to the Karaite side either, in at least in that sphere. And even in Israel, I know that some of the Karaite chief rabbis, quote unquote, weren't very enthusiastic about accepting Ashkenazim or Sephardim for that matter, rabbinites who wanted to join them. I think it was, I don't know if it was Chaim Levi, but it may have been Chaim Levi or one of the other chief rabbis, perhaps Basuda, who said, a donkey is a donkey, a horse is a horse. A horse can't become a donkey. Something along those lines. That was in the context of Alfandari, who was a Sephardic Jew. I'm sure you've heard of, I think it was Joseph Alfandari.
Yeah.
Sephardic Jew who really got into Karaism and wanted to join, but they never let him. They let him get buried in the Karaite cemetery, but that's it.
Yeah, well, I think the attitude has changed.
Yeah.
Also, there is they also have a problem. The Karaites have a problem with arayot, with incest laws.
Yes.
So just as rabbinic Jews would say, a child of a remarriage is a mamzer, right. Karaite Jews would say, well, you have two brothers or two sisters, or you have a yibum situation, or you have a cousin or something, or an uncle with a niece, which they forbid and Rabbinic Judaism recommends. Then right. Those are also questions of arayot. Let me just say, in terms of misconceptions in Karaite history, which is you began asking about, one of the conceptions is that in the 9th century, when Karaism started to spread, it was taking over the Jewish world, that all the Jews were becoming Karaites. And then Rav Saadia Gaon, at the beginning of the 10th century, he died in 942, was the one who put his finger into the dike and stopped the spread of Karaism. And if it hadn't been for Rav Saadia Gaon, we'd be talking tonight about a small, marginal Jewish group that doesn't eat meat and milk together, that had Shavuot on different days of the week, that etc. That used candles, that ate cholent, etc. Right. But there's really no indication that there is this massive takeover of the Jewish people. And I mentioned Kir Kasani, Saadia's contemporary, who says no two Karaites agree about anything. The situation gets worse from day to day. So my reinterpretation, I say in the book, is that what Saadia basically did was force people to take sides. In the 9th century, there are a lot of people, even the Balei Masorah, the Ben Asher Ben Naphtali, we don't know for sure that they are rabbinites. Many people think they were Karaites. And I think they just might have been, I won't say non-political, but had different customs of from different groups.
Right.
And then Saadia said, look, these are separate groups. You can't be a member of both. And the Karaites, with all these disagreements under Kir Kasani, said, he's right. Let's get our act together. So Saadia had more of a part in unifying charism than he had in defeating charism in a sense. And also keep in mind that people talk about charism as more intellectual and it's the lower classes, which isn't true. These are people that made you sit in your house on Shabbat with no lights, no warm food, who had laws of ritual purity. If you touch a dead insect, you become ritually impure. Sexual relations cause ritual impurity. I mean, it's a very rigorous type of Judaism, in addition to the fact that it had very little popular religion. And we know from the Geniza that magic was very popular, magical bowls, those kinds of things, which the Karaites absolutely forbid. And no mystical aspect of the religion. I mean, later on, they adopted it. So it's not exactly, you wouldn't expect it to become a mass movement of any religion. And to think that the Jews in the Middle East were different than other people, I don't buy it.
What a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. Professor Daniel Lasker, I really appreciate it. I encourage everyone to read up on this. Purchase the book Charism. It's available online. And I really enjoyed the conversation. We can talk more. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Thank you for having me. Good night.